now. So if anyone who is in attendance, you'll be getting an email at the end with the recording attached, but we'll also be making this available afterwards. If you'd like to come back to it, just let us know. But all right, Fred, are you ready to have a good conversation?
Let's hope so. Let's go.
All right, perfect. Well, first I'd like to start by thanking everybody for taking the time to join us today. You've got myself, Christopher Perry, Senior Technical Support Engineer here at PortalGuard, and Fred DeHaan has joined me to present today, and he's the Senior Web Application Admin for Contra Costa Community College District. And if you think that's a mouthful, just wait till we get started. All right. So the first thing we're going to go over is a quick agenda. So today's meeting is a continuation of a previous webinar that we had, trying to finish out Contra Costa's customer journey with PortalGuard. Previously, we focused on some single sign-on aspects and some customizations that Contra Costa managed with PortalGuard. Today, we're going to see where they're headed, why they decided to go that way, and why they're sticking with PortalGuard. So for anybody who has missed our last webinar and is interested in seeing it again, it is available under the webinars section of our website, just portalguard.com, and you can check that out anytime. Otherwise, let's dive right in, Fred.
Yep.
All right, so I already mentioned we're talking about multi-factor authentication today. So the first thing that I want to go over for everybody is what was Contra Costa's motivation in making the jump to multi-factor authentication?
Well, as the screen actually is showing, it like has multiple layers of that, and I think they all sort of include in the motivation, starting with the motivation, and we go on for that. Probably the most obvious thing with the multi-factor is security. As we all know, some institutions and universities and colleges, they had security breaches that they lost a great amount of data. So one of the things that we started thinking, obviously, was how do we secure that? How do we secure the data, and especially sensitive data that we have in our system? And one of the obvious basically approaches is that limiting the number of people accessing that data and securing it in order to make sure that we don't allow that kind of breach. So we knew that multi-factor was one of the ways to do this, and we had been talking to PortalGuard actually about what other security we could have, what we can do, and they told us, and this is a little while ago, and they said that they were working on multi-factor, and actually we were happy that they started introducing different way of basically multi-factor. So why do we do that? Was our basically motivation. The biggest thing is that how do we secure the data? So that was, I think that's the motivation for most institutions is that.
Yeah, and before we move on, Fred, just real quick, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. Not only, obviously, you want to secure that sensitive data, but it's important to remember something we touched on last time, which is that you've got PortalGuard acting as the front end for probably, I think we said, over 140 different applications. So at that point, security does really become a priority. But not only that, when you mention sensitive data, that also falls back into something that you did with PortalGuard in the past, right? Because you've started relying a lot heavily on one of our existing backend databases for some of that user information, right?
Exactly. Perfect. That's a very good point.
Yeah, because yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that kind of leads us into where you were going, which is why PortalGuard? Because like you mentioned, we've talked in the past quite a few times and quite often All good things. But one of the things that's always come up is, hey, we've got this great product. What else can we do with it? We've handled single sign-on, and single sign-on by itself includes some security measures. I mean, that's kind of standard practice when you use industry standard protocols, right? They
Correct.
do secure the data in transit, and all the lower frontier client side recommendations are there. So you got your secure data, secure claims, no passwords, and that's all well and good. But Fred and I have always talked about, great, we've handled that side of things, but I still have people getting on my network, trying to access machines. How can I lock down who's accessing what and just make sure that the right people that have the access, are doing it securely. And one of the things that kept coming up was the fact that PortalGuard, being an authentication solution, not just an IDP, we do have hooks into the authentication process in a lot of these stages. So being able to piggyback off of PortalGuard, and I think Fred can probably speak a little bit more to this point, that makes it a little bit easier to add additional security to an existing solution as opposed to, let's say, having to go piecemeal it together, right?
Correct. Very good. Well, yeah, you said it much better than I could. So, that is the fact. The multi-factor, like Christopher said. I mean, PortalGuard itself, and that's and maybe I go back to this why PortalGuard, and then go back to motivation again. But why PortalGuard was because we had been working with PortalGuard. And we were happy with it, and we relied on it more and more and more. Basically, every vendor that we worked with, we made sure that we could actually integrate or single sign-on with PortalGuard. That's why we ended up having about 140 different applications that we use PortalGuard with. And because of that, because we relied on it, and because it's high availability, meaning that there was PortalGuard we've had no issues with as far as the system being going down or any hiccups and everything. So it was solid. So it just makes sense to build on that, obviously. Now there's multi-factors. Obviously, for when you log in, the first time you log in, or when you log into any of the applications, multi-factor, it makes sense, except each institution has to decide how they want to use it also. So for us, for a small institution, multi-factor with the students, it makes more sense than for us to use that part of it with the students, meaning we have 30 to 50,000 students, pushing the multi-factor for logging in at least, or forcing them to do the one-time pass, not one-time, but the multi-factor. It was a little bit, we as an institution decided that maybe we don't want to go that route with the students, but we really wanted to do it with the staff.
Right. So
and the reason for it was the reason for that was that as far as the students and PortalGuard goes, we felt very comfortable in that part of it. And as Christopher said, it's like that already has that security basically built in. So go ahead, Christopher.
Yep. So I was going to say, you touched on another point that's going to come up again later. It's that you're not necessarily rolling multi-factor out to everybody. That's part of your multi-factor journey, is the fact that you want to start with a smaller, and I use that term loosely, subset of users, right? Like you said, it's the faculty and staff as opposed to the whole 30 to 50,000 student body, right?
Correct.
And that touches on point 3 here, which is security versus usability for the end users. Because that's one of the things that everybody's always trying to balance, right? Is how do you add security without upsetting all of your end users? Because on the administrative side, yes, the more security, the better, less data breaches. But then the flip side of that is if you make things too secure and you upset all your end users, then they're just going to try to find ways around it, which adds even more insecure practices. So for Contra Costa's little multi-factor journey, we'll call it, separating that out and saying, okay, let's just focus on this one group of users. That kind of made things a little bit more manageable. And correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, but I think separating it out and choosing faculty and staff versus students, that also allows you to use a subset of users that are more expectant and willing to be required for those extra steps for the security, right?
Correct. Exactly.
Awesome. So before we move on from this slide, I want to give you a chance to fill in anything that we've missed, but we are going to touch on some of the points you mentioned already. One thing I did want to at least get out there in the air for consideration is when you started thinking about multi-factor authentication, you decided to go with PortalGuard. Were there any issues specifically that you said, okay, we want to do multi-factor authentication, we know this is going to be a problem, let's see if we can resolve it ahead of time, sort of nip it in the bud, so to speak?
Yes. Yes. Well, maybe the coming at it a different way was, like I said, it was more of fear of security, fear of losing data. Okay, so that was the biggest motivation and the biggest push for us was that, and that's one of the reasons we started talking to you. And the specific issue was logging into our sensitive data, basically.
Perfect.
Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, no, that's good. So that actually brings us right into the next slide here. So as we said, small subset of users to start. We're looking at faculty and staff versus the whole user count. And that we didn't really touch on it too much, but there is a little bit of internal and external requirements. And then I believe the third point here, actively building on introducing MFA over the long term. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, but part of your planning, was it eventually to roll in more and more users, maybe not to hit everybody, but to kind of expand the scope of the multi-factor over time?
Right. And the thing is that the way it's I'm not sure how much we're going to talk about in detail about the multi-factor that you have, but there are different scenarios and different ways of approaching it. So I mean, depending on what it is we want to do and what group of people we want to give which kind of multi-factor security. And like I said, we'll talk about a little bit. I think we have that, or is that here? Talking about different scenarios, meaning we have certain computers we want to we want to make sure that anybody who's accessing it, or applications actually, it's like anybody who's accessing it, we wanted to have that multi-factor. We actually tested the several scenarios. One was a list of group of people. Says, okay, I want these people to have multi-factor all the time. Then we said, okay, what about if we want to do it by IP addresses? So we wanted to do basically certain IP addresses would have multi-factor, and then we could also exclude some of the IP addresses. So we were playing around with all of these scenarios, the different ways of, because PortalGuard gives you that option.
Yep, and yeah, so what you're talking about here, Fred, that's our contextual authentication, and I do want to circle back to that. Right. That's definitely one of we really consider that as a method of multi-factor, and that's a little bit more detailed than the order that I've got set up here, so I do want to put a pin in that just for the moment. Okay. Obviously, talking about that was, one of the contextual authentication is one of the main options here. But I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, which was the kind of the simplest first step, right, was doing the multi-factor for the applications themselves, logging into PortalGuard, into the actual SSO applications, right? Right, correct. So yeah, so that's why I've got here is like the first scenario. That's that application-specific two-factor. And this slide, I've just got a quick, image of Fred's portal that they're using, just because it looks so nice, and I like to help him promote the hard work that he did. But Now, we talked a little bit, Fred, ahead of time about some of the ways that we were looking at application-specific two-factor, because this hasn't been fully implemented at this time. It's still an ongoing project, right?
Correct.
Yep. So
Correct. Some of them I already put in and I tested it. Some of them I haven't yet.
Yep. So one of the things that, and this is going to be a little bit of me going into detail on some of the multi-factor that you've done, Fred, so I don't want to talk over you, but one of the things that comes with the application-specific two-factor is this optional two-factor at the main login. So one of the things that that functionality does is it allows your end users to not only say, hey, I want to secure my account for everything, all logins, I want to do two-factor. But if they opt not to do that, you as an administrator can still say, that's fine, that's your choice, but if you're going to access some of these sensitive applications, let's say an HR application or a student resource management application, this gives you the option as an administrator to say, if you're accessing one of those sensitive applications, you need to prove to me that you are able to provide a second factor that only you would have access to. And that's
Correct.
what this application-specific two-factor is. So when you're talking something like Contra Costa, right, you've got 140 apps. We could probably split that down the middle and say faculty and staff aren't going to be accessing all 140, maybe 50 to 70, and probably what, a small subset of those are considered sensitive.
Right. Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
So
we
yeah,
already have like some of the application we already have a certain amount of security on that, so we make sure that the data is not out there. But so that's why we don't want to put multi-factor for every single thing. Mm-hmm. You really don't want to put security for course searchers, for example, because it's open. It's like there's no need for that. But there's for other things you do want to do that. So go ahead.
Yeah, and that just kind of touches in on that balancing usability and security again. The big thing with application-specific two-factor is, as an administrator, you get to say, yes, these things absolutely need more security, but it doesn't have to be a real detractor for the end users, because when they only have to do it once or twice, and it is session-based, then it's not as impactful. They don't have to say, oh, why do I have to do this every single time? They only need to do it, let's say, the once for their session. So it's a nice feature that I know you are using that actually helps you keep that kind of happy and secure balance.
All right.
And the last point here is just you already touched on it, which is piggybacking on the built-in website security, like you said, to make sure the data is not getting out, from extra access points and all that. So PortalGuard in this case ends up being that final cap on the multi-factor for the application that says, I've secured all the other access points, now I'm securing the user.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
All right, perfect. So as far as, go ahead. I was just going to ask you, Fred, if there's anything else you wanted to add on before we switch to your other big scenario.
No, let's go to the next one because I'm pretty sure I'm going to talk about other stuff too. Sure. I don't want to go into tangents.
No worries. So one of the other big things that we talked about, and that's still ongoing, and you and I actually are going to be having some more meetings on, was this VPN two-factor authentication. Now this, I do want to stress for Fred's benefit, this is definitely an ongoing project, unless Fred's gotten all willy-nilly on me and done it without me. But I know we've been talking about this. And this is where that external users security comes into play, right? We talked about this briefly. Correct. Where you had mentioned, hey, actually we have some VPN users logging in and management has decided we need to keep them, accessing everything securely. And I had said, hey, what's your firewall? What are you using for VPN? And that's what I've got here. It's this Palo Alto Global Protect. And we did a little bit of digging and lo and behold, it's a good fit for PortalGuard because they support the Radius protocol. So we can use that to secure these external users. And that's kind of one of the things that it's important to note because a lot of people just think, oh, external security, I'm just going to add two-factor onto the website, onto the application, I'm done. They're accessing it over the internet, they have access, they're secure. But really, the VPN side of things, it's important to keep in mind because if you're not using it, you don't think about it, but VPN access is a frequent target for attackers. So it's an avenue that's worth securing. And having you bring it up, Fred, was pretty awesome, because then it led me to say, hey, if you're really serious about security, let's talk about VPN two-factor. So I don't know if you want to expand a little bit on why that came up on your end, but feel free.
Well, I think anybody who works with VPN and allowing users accessing the system externally knows that is always a crucial thing with security. We really do have a robust VPN, but at the same time, it's like we still wanted to make sure that they are a certain VPN, certain people who actually have the VPN, they are in a secure place, that they are actually cognizant of, because besides having a multi-factor, making sure the person who is actually accessing the system is the person, and adding another layer, it also brings up to the user's attention that you are doing a multi-factor, meaning that you're going to that area that is more secure, okay, than your normal thing. So if you are at your desk at work, you may not have, and we will not have a multi-factor at that point. But if you're coming in from external, you're getting a multi-factor. It's something a little bit different than you logging up just to VPN. So it gives you that heads up saying you're actually entering an area that is more sensitive. So beware.
Perfect. So it's almost like an implicit end user communication that says, hey, you're required to do more security because what you're doing is not considered secure by default.
All right. And it's not, we don't have a lot of users that we don't give access to VPN to a lot of users. There's certain users that they can do that. And even with that, we just wanted to make sure, that they do come in and they're aware, and they also are the person who's supposed to be accessing the system.
Yeah, because like you said, you don't give it to just anybody. So lo and behold, you might have, let's say, an attacker who comes in and says, oh, look, I've got my hands on a nice faculty member's credentials. I bet you I can get VPN access to all this student information. But just getting their credentials, they try to access, and you've got PortalGuard set up that says, hey, actually, I need you to go ahead and put in a code from your mobile authenticator before you can access. And they got the credentials, but they don't have the code. They don't have the phone. So there's your go. And then by that time, your end user is going to say, hey, unfortunately, I need to change my password or whatever. The rest of your normal security policies there, but it's a nice little catch that says, yes, I've let these few users have this backdoor into my network, and because of that, I want to make sure that it's only them and it's actually a secure channel.
And we actually, just to make the correction, is that we don't even give VPN to faculties, only staff.
Sorry.
And only very certain amount of staff. No, just unless the faculty is actually, partial, like a staff and faculty both. But it's just the most staff.
All right, Fred, slap me on the wrist, why don't you? Particularly chagrined, what can I say?
I just didn't want you to get a question. Says, hey, wait a second, you guys giving VPN to faculty? Like, no, not to staff.
Hey, you're always watching my back. That's why I like you. I'll return the favor, I promise. All right. So what do you think, Fred? Anything else specific to the VPN that you want to cover before we move on?
Not necessarily VPN, but I don't know if you have the slides for the coming in from a different IP address, not your own desktop.
Not specifically, but that's kind of one of the talking points I wanted to do here, so I think we're okay.
Okay.
Yep. So before we dive into that, Fred, just to reiterate what everybody, for everybody here, what Fred's talking about, making authentication choices based on things like IP address, or if you're at home, if you're outside of the expected time frame for being able to log in, or if you're authenticating from a different country, those type of things all fall under one of our, what we call an MFA option. It's our contextual authentication. It's where we allow PortalGuard, just like the name says, to use the context of your authentication attempt to determine which security bracket you fall into. So that's like what Fred had mentioned before. If you're outside of your office accessing it from home, you might get that two-factor prompt that you're not used to, because when you're on network, you're getting Kerberos authentication, you're on your workstation, you never see a two-factor prompt because you're considered implicitly secure because you're on network. And it is wildly configurable there. So just to kind of set the stage, Fred, on the background there.
Yeah. So the other thing that we wanted to basically approach was, even if you're in the office, let's say, and I am on somebody else's desk, and I'm trying to access, the some application. Let's say we want to access Colleague or Banner, or directly, or anything like that. But even if I log in to try to log in and from a different desktop than and not my own, we want to set that up also to make sure that whoever is accessing it from another computer is also can be multi-factored.
Yeah, and that's something we've just recently started discussing, correct,
Right.
Fred? Yeah, because that's not typically included in something like contextual authentication at this stage, but it is something that Contra Costa has brought up that we've started to at least do a minor investigation into to see as a potential feature request. Because to the the point of this webinar and just this conversation is that security is important, and what we want to be able to do is make sure that you as customers can actually get the security and the secure access that you want with one solution. So we're always open to these kind of suggestions because, hey, we don't always think of everything, but we're sure is going to give you what we can, right, Fred?
Right, and that goes back to the last webinar. We were talking about our relationship with PortalGuard in the last years. Since the beginning that we worked with PortalGuard, it's exactly been this way. That they come up, we ask about something, or they have already started working on something. They let us know, and they give us an option of making some comments on it. And that's the relationship that we've had, and that's what we really like, is that I can go back and talk to Christopher or Greg and say, okay, I think we're gonna need this part, and sometimes actually it's like more than one, more than not. It's just they already are working on some scenarios and that the thought process that we're going through. So I just wanted to give you that, Christopher, because it's been great, and it's like coming back to you guys and saying, what about this? And you guys said, well, we've thought about this and we're working on it, or yeah, let's explore that. And you guys have never said no, so that's great.
And I mean, yeah, that's a good point worth mentioning, because I know some of the MFA options, Fred, that you've actually been experiencing or trying to play with. We talked about contextual, but I think SMS was one of them because it was an easy option. But then, just like you said, you also brought up fingerprint. And then one of the first things that we said was, oh, hey, by the way, that's actually something we're about to implement. And, so I know you've been playing around with that, so I don't want to go into it too much, but it's a good example of how we're always trying to innovate. We're always trying to add these functionalities to make our solution the best fit for you. Fingerprint is one of the latest ones, along with smart card authentication, FIDO U2F keys for the newer hard token aficionados out there. We're up to over 16 different OTP types for multi-factor authentication. And even though we didn't touch on self-service during this conversation, the benefit of PortalGuard, as Fred can attest to, is if you require the enrollment for some of these multi-factor options, your end users have the option to utilize those for things like self-service as well, in case they prefer that option instead. So it's a nice thing to keep in mind that it all kind of ties back together. You don't just enroll fingerprint or a mobile authenticator just to do two-factor. You can, but as an administrator, you can also allow that kind of access to the end user to say, hey, you've got this set up. why don't you go ahead and use it for your password reset as well in case you can't remember all those answers to those pesky challenge questions.
Yep. You said it good.
I speak good.
You speak good. Not even well. It's good.
There you go. The English major in me is dying a little bit right now. But so we're going to move away from that. All right. So as we are moving forward with this multi-factor project, Fred, and I'm not trying to beat a dead horse or anything. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we turn it over to questions. We're definitely focusing on the VPN and getting you that unique access scenario, maybe tweaking the contextual authentication. But one thing I wanted to kind of touch on is there's not really a time frame, right? It's implementing as soon as it's ready at this point. Does that sound about right?
Right. Exactly.
Because you want to make sure to do it right. So that's why we're kind of partnering in with each other. And that brings me just to my final summary here, which Fred's heard probably a dozen times. But when you get PortalGuard, you're not buying a solution, or you're not buying a product, excuse me, you're buying a solution. We're not just trying to give you single sign-on. If that's all you need, great. But we're also here if you want to take that and say, hey, we'd also like to do what Contra Costa did. We want to add some secure access to our solution as well. Great. You don't have to go anywhere else. That's what we're here for. So it's important to keep in mind because a lot of people might be listening in and saying, hey, I want MFA. And then they hear single sign-on. They're like, oh, yeah, I also kind of want that too. So keep in mind, PortalGuard is not just an MFA solution. It's not just a single sign-on or a password reset solution. It's your full-service authentication solution. We want you to be able to solve your problems today, but also address any future needs that might come up. And as Fred has done a really great job of the testing during this webinar and our previous one, which I do recommend you check out, our success is measured by that of our customer. So we want you to succeed, and that's the only way that we succeed. So we've got a pretty large team here. We love helping our customers. So with these things like this active journey that for multi-factor that Contra Costa is doing, we want to be involved in that. I've been talking to Fred. What have you guys been around for? What do we say, 4 or 5 years almost now? And I think I've been talking to you pretty much that entire time. So I've been involved in here and there and bits and pieces. So it's definitely an active relationship. And even after today's call, I know Fred and I were going to be talking again about how to implement some of these multi-factor authentication requirements for VPN and so on. So we're definitely here to make sure that whatever journey you're on, you're going to succeed. And unless Fred has anything else he wants to say about the multi-factor journey that Contra Costa is undergoing, I think I can turn it over for some questions now.
Yep. I've said all I wanted to say at this point. If anybody else wants to talk to me directly, they can too. Like I said, I'm open to talking about our solutions and our journey and all of that. I have no problem talking, or even if you guys implementing a PortalGuard any way that we can. And Christopher knows. You can contact Christopher. He can give you my information and contact information, and I have no problem going through that.
Well, it's a very kind offer, and I can attest, as Fred mentioned, he does enjoy helping people succeed just as much as I do. So it's definitely a nice guy to reach out to, making use of that offer as we speak with another customer. So he's definitely sincere. But with that being said, feel free, if anybody's got any questions, you can unmute yourself and chime in, or if you're a little gun shy about speaking in front of everybody, you can always send a message in the chat. I'll monitor that, and I can always read it out loud and answer it for you. Otherwise, I'll stay silent for a couple minutes and see what you guys have for us. What do you think, Fred? Either we did a good job or we just bored them to sleep.
Well, there was a lot of information out there, actually. There is a lot of information.
That is true. And again, I do want to remind everybody, this is being recorded, and we'll be able to send that to you as well. So if you again, if you don't have any questions now, but you end up revisiting the webinar and you have some questions afterward, we have a support portal accessible from our PortalGuard website, where I'm happy to address any technical questions. You can also send an email to techsupport@portalguard.com, but we also have live chat on our website as well, standing by for existing customers, anybody who might have any questions that way. So I don't want you to feel forced to ask anything here today, but I am more than happy while we're here to address those.
No questions.
You know, I'm pretty confident that we did a good job, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. Well, I don't want to keep everybody just listening to the sound of Fred and I laughing at each other. So I'm going to go ahead and end this call. And again, any last call for questions, feel free to interrupt me before I do. But I'm going to go ahead and end this call and go ahead and convert that recording so that you can have it for reference. But please feel free to reach out to us, either Fred or myself directly. Like I said, we want you to succeed, and if we can help you do that, we're more than happy to. All right. Well,
All right.
Fred, I know you have things to do today. Thank you very much for your time today. And everybody who took the time to join the webinar, I want to express my gratitude to you as well. I do appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking with you all personally and seeing you on future webinars. Thank you again.
Thank you. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Bye.